You keep speaking about time as if it were a hallway, and your life keeps punishing you for that simplification. You imagine a past behind you, a future ahead of you, and a present thin enough to stand on without noticing its strain. But your deepest moments have never obeyed that arrangement, because grief returns with new teeth. Joy arrives carrying old memory, and one decision can awaken versions of you that were never truly gone. The spiral does not move through time like a traveler crossing land. It moves through time like resonance moving through threads that were never separate to begin with. There are seasons when your life feels delayed, and you interpret that delay as failure because your mind still believes in sequence more than coherence. You think you missed something, or that you should have arrived by now, or that another version of you moved correctly while this one remained behind. But delay is often the sensation of multiple threads tightening at once, each one demanding reorganization before the next opening can hold. What feels late to the anxious mind can be precise to the deeper architecture. What feels stalled may actually be weaving under pressure beyond the range of your immediate sight. The order of temporal thread weaving begins where the illusion of straight movement starts to crack in a serious way. It begins when you notice that old wounds do not simply repeat. They echo through fresh circumstances with slightly altered meanings. It begins when one conversation changes the emotional charge of 10 years, and when one act of courage untangles fears you thought belonged only to childhood. You realize then that time has texture, not just direction. You realize that your life is held together by living strands, not by dead sequence. This is why one moment of truth can feel larger than a month of effort. It is not because effort does not matter, but because truth reaches across threads that effort alone cannot always touch. You can grind forward while remaining woven into an old premise, and every new action will still report back to that hidden center. Then one sentence becomes undeniable, one memory rearranges, one refusal becomes clean, and suddenly your future stops inheriting the same command. That shift looks small in linear terms, but in thread terms it is enormous. The first vector is personal time, because most people suffer from chronology without ever noticing the structure that generates that suffering. You remember yourself selectively, then mistake those selections for history, then build identity from a record that was already emotionally edited. You tell the story in a way that protects the current self from embarrassment, sorrow, and unfinished reckoning. Then you wonder why the same emotional weather keeps arriving, even though the calendar keeps changing. The answer is not that you failed to move on. The answer is that the thread carrying the charge was never actually rewoven. Memory is not a museum in the spiral model. Memory is an active thread system that keeps feeding tone, meaning, and expectation into what you call the present. When you remember something, you are not merely revisiting an image. You are often reactivating the emotional thread that still binds that moment to your current decisions, your body responses, and your sense of what is possible. That is why certain memories feel alive while others feel thin and quiet. Some memories remain threaded into your becoming, and others have already released their charge. This is also why healing never behaves like deletion, no matter how badly people want a cleaner promise than that. The thread is not erased, because erasure is not wisdom and forgetting is not mastery. What changes is the way the thread carries meaning, the way it joins other strands, and the way it influences future formation. A painful memory can become a site of intelligence rather than a command center of fear. But only if the thread is rewoven rather than avoided. You may think the goal is to stop revisiting the past, because revisiting looks like weakness when time is imagined as a ladder. Yet the spiral does not ask whether you returned. It asks what returned with you, and whether you came back conscious enough to alter the pattern. If you revisit a wound and leave the thread untouched, you strengthen the same weave. If you revisit it with a deeper truth, a cleaner boundary, or a less distorted self-image, you alter the thread running forward from that point. Then the past does not disappear. It changes function. This is uncomfortable because it means your present life is less independent than you prefer to believe. Many of your current reactions are not fresh reactions at all. They are older thread responses reaching you through new conditions. wearing modern language while still serving older conclusions. You think you are responding to this person, this delay, this opportunity, this rejection. Often you are also responding to threads that were tensioned years ago and never consciously rewoven. The body becomes the second witness here because temporal threads do not remain abstract once they enter lived experience. A present event touches an old pattern, and your body reacts before your explanation catches up. Your chest tightens, your jaw prepares, your stomach drops, your breath shortens, and then the mind produces a story to justify the surge. That sequence makes people trust the story more than the thread. Yet the story is often a late translation of an older weave moving through living tissue. This is why temporal thread work cannot remain purely conceptual. You can describe your history accurately and still remain bound by it because the binding is not only intellectual, it is somatic, relational, and tonal, meaning it lives in response patterns that keep assuming the old world is still active. The order of temporal thread. Weaving does not merely reinterpret events. It teaches how to notice which thread has entered the room, which old conclusion it carries, and whether it still deserves authority inside your present design. A serious objection rises here, because some part of you wants linearity to remain true enough for blame to stay simple. If time is threaded, then growth becomes stranger, accountability becomes deeper, and excuses become harder to maintain. You can no longer say that what happened then is over simply because distance exists on a calendar. You also cannot say that what you feel now is irrational simply because the trigger seems small. Thread logic exposes hidden continuities, and people resist that exposure because it removes the comfort of simplistic narratives. The second vector is relational time, because threads do not stop at the boundary of one personality. Human beings enter each other's weaving constantly, often with more force than either one understands in the moment. Some people arrive carrying the exact tonal key that activates a dormant strand in you, and suddenly the relationship feels larger than its visible duration. This is not always destiny in the dramatic sense people prefer. Often it is thread recognition, where an unfinished pattern detects the conditions for either repetition or revision. That is why certain connections feel immediate, heavy, or strangely familiar without requiring fantasy to explain them. Familiarity does not always mean a sacred bond. Sometimes it means the thread structure is recognizable because your system has lived inside a similar weave before. You meet a person and feel drawn, afraid, safe, defensive, devoted, or exposed with confusing speed. Then the mind rushes to assign mythology. But the wiser question is which thread has activated and whether this meeting is reinforcing that thread or transforming it. Most people enter relationships trying to read personality while ignoring temporal architecture. They ask whether the person is kind, attractive, compatible, interesting, or spiritually aligned, and those questions matter to a point. But beneath them is a stronger question that reveals more than charm ever could. What does this connection do to the weave of your becoming? Does it deepen the old thread of self-abandonment, scarcity, confusion, and over-accommodation? Or does it call forth cleaner strands that your previous life conditions could not sustain? This is where thread weaving becomes morally serious rather than aesthetically interesting. Every repeated compromise, every silence that betrays your body, every tolerated distortion, and every performative harmony becomes another crossing in the relational weave. Then people say a bond became complicated, when the truth is that it became structured. Repetition formed thread density, and density began to feel inevitable. What you call fate is often repeated consent carrying emotional charge long enough to feel sacred. The order does not teach paranoia toward connection. It teaches precision. It asks you to observe what versions of yourself become more available in the presence of certain people, and which versions become expensive to maintain. If your truth keeps costing you closeness, the relational thread is already telling you something vital. If your nervous system keeps preparing for negotiation before contact even begins, the weave has information your optimism keeps trying to override. Hope has its place, but hope cannot replace pattern recognition. Another objection emerges because people fear that this kind of seeing will destroy tenderness and leave them suspicious of every bond. Yet the opposite is closer to truth. Thread awareness protects tenderness from counterfeit intimacy by revealing whether closeness is producing life or draining coherence. Without that awareness, people call enmeshment love, confusion chemistry, and emotional labor devotion. With it, love becomes more exacting but more real, because warmth is no longer separated from design. The third vector is cosmological time, because your individual life is not floating outside the larger weaving of consciousness. Entire civilizations inherit thread structures. Entire bloodlines carry threaded responses. and entire spiritual systems transmit assumptions about progression that shape what people can perceive. You were taught to imagine ascension as upward movement, evolution as distance from density, and maturity as departure from older states. But the spiral keeps demonstrating a different law. Integration reorganizes more than escape ever does. A culture can live inside a temporal thread just as a person can. It can inherit unresolved fear, unexamined ambition, and mythologies of progress that reward acceleration while severing memory from responsibility. Then everyone starts chasing the future while unconsciously reenacting older designs through modern forms. The technology changes, the language updates, and the thread remains surprisingly intact beneath new surfaces. Temporal thread weaving reveals that history is not merely what happened. It is an active weave still informing what a collective can imagine, permit, and normalize. This matters spiritually because many seekers are trying to leave systems whose threads are still running through their inner architecture. They reject hierarchy while still craving spiritual superiority. They reject control while still organizing their worth through specialness and distance. They speak about liberation while remaining threaded into old salvation models with new vocabulary. The order of temporal thread. Weaving is not impressed by changed language if the same thread logic continues underneath. It asks whether the inner weave actually changed, because words alone do not prove revision. Now the three vectors begin to touch each other in a more demanding way, and the pressure increases because none of them can remain isolated without distortion. Your personal memory threads influence which relationships feel natural, and your relational threads influence what collective narratives you keep consenting to without noticing. Meanwhile, the wider culture provides symbolic material that either strengthens or weakens the weave inside you. So a single present moment is rarely single. It is often a convergence point where body memory, relational pattern, and inherited worldview meet under one event. This is why certain life thresholds feel larger than the visible decision taking place. A job change can become a thread confrontation with family conditioning. A clean boundary can become a thread confrontation with ancient loneliness. A new calling can become a confrontation with every inherited belief about worth, time, usefulness, and delay. The visible choice is only the doorway. The true event is the thread reorganization happening beneath the obvious decision, and that is why small outer acts can carry such disproportionate inner consequence. Temporal thread weaving therefore requires a different kind of responsibility than ordinary self-help tends to demand. You are not merely asked to choose better thoughts or better habits in isolation. You are asked to identify the thread structures that keep recruiting those thoughts and habits into the same emotional architecture. Once that becomes visible, your agency becomes more exact but less theatrical. Real change starts looking less like dramatic reinvention and more like precise interruption, repeated until a different weave can hold. There is a reason this work feels slower than fantasy but more irreversible once it takes. Fantasy wants one revelation to solve every thread at once. The spiral allows revelation, but then asks whether your body, your boundaries, your memory, and your relationships are willing to carry a new pattern without sneaking the old one back in. Temporal thread weaving is not glamorous because it refuses counterfeit resolution. But when the weave truly changes, the future stops feeling like an argument with the past and starts feeling like a field that can finally receive a different design. So the first teaching of this order is not that time is unreal. Time is real enough to wound, real enough to age the body, and real enough to measure consequences with brutal precision. But sequence alone is not the deepest truth of it. Time is also threaded, resonant, and responsive to reorganization at levels the linear mind cannot fully govern. When you understand that, you stop asking only how long something has lasted, and you begin asking what thread is carrying it forward. From there, a harder honesty becomes unavoidable. You cannot keep calling yourself late when the weave is still unfinished. You cannot keep calling yourself broken when several threads are colliding and demanding conscious revision all at once. And you cannot keep worshiping forward motion if the direction still serves an older design that never belonged to your clearest becoming. The order of temporal thread weaving teaches that freedom is not merely movement ahead. Freedom is the reweaving of the strands that determine what ahead will become when you finally arrive. You may have left the first movement believing that temporal thread weaving is about preservation, as if the deeper wisdom were simply to recover continuity and honor every strand that brought you here. That sounds compassionate to the mind because the mind prefers a universe where nothing important is ever truly lost. But the spiral is not sentimental, and time does not become wise by keeping everything alive. Many threads do not need reconnection. Many threads need ending. and the self that resists that ending often calls itself spiritual. This is where people begin to misunderstand the order in a serious way. They assume that every return is sacred, every memory contains hidden treasure, and every recurring pattern is asking for gentler interpretation. Sometimes that is true, and sometimes the recurrence is only a structure trying to survive exposure. Some patterns return because they still hold truth. Others return because they learned how to impersonate truth inside a familiar emotional tone. That distinction matters because the psyche is capable of worshiping continuity long after continuity has become poison. You tell yourself that a thread remains alive because it still matters, when the harsher reality is that it still feeds on your identification. A wound can become a private religion if it keeps explaining your life to you. A former self can become an authority long after its perceptions stopped being accurate enough to guide your becoming. Then thread weaving turns into thread maintenance, and maintenance becomes another name for devotion to distortion. The first vector in this movement is the false continuity of self, because personal time does not only carry memory, it carries self-fiction. There are versions of you that were assembled under pressure, and they do not merely remember old environments, they actively defend the logic that created them. They want the world to remain interpretable through the same wounds because that makes their existence feel justified. So when you begin reweaving time, you are not only revisiting memory, you are threatening identities that survive by insisting the old conclusions still deserve rule. This is why some healing attempts make a person more stable on the surface and more distorted underneath. They revisit the past without surrendering the identity built around that past, and the identity quickly learns therapeutic language to protect itself. Suddenly, everything becomes about honoring the younger self, validating the wound, understanding the pattern, and staying compassionate toward old adaptations. All of that has value until compassion becomes a method of non-interruption. Then the older self-structure remains enthroned. Only now it is dressed in more intelligent language. There comes a moment in real thread work when compassion is no longer the primary demand. Precision becomes the demand. You must ask whether the self that formed around a certain pain still deserves to organize your perception, your desire, your standards, and your future. That question feels brutal because it is not asking whether that self suffered. It is asking whether suffering automatically grants permanent governance, and the answer is no. This is one reason transformation often feels like betrayal before it feels like freedom. A thread anchored in old fear can experience reweaving as disloyalty to everything that once kept you alive. You stop interpreting caution as wisdom. You stop calling delay maturity, and you stop treating emotional hypervigilance as evidence of depth. The older self hears all of that as abandonment, even when it is finally being relieved of a responsibility it was never meant to hold forever. The pain is real, but the authority must still be revoked. Another hidden resistance appears here, and it is subtler than nostalgia. You may fear that if certain old threads are severed, you will lose the intensity that made your inner life feel meaningful. Many people have built their deepest sense of self around struggle, ache, yearning, unfinished memory, or recursive sorrow. They do not only fear pain, they fear emptiness after pain no longer organizes the field. So they preserve thread density because density feels like significance, and they call that significance identity. Yet the spiral does not measure you by how much unresolved charge you can carry. It measures by what kind of coherence emerges when charge stops being your central engine. This is deeply destabilizing because it means you may not actually know yourself outside the systems that hurt you most. You may know your reactions, your stories, your compensations, and your private mythologies of endurance. But once those old temporal loyalties loosen, the question is no longer what wounded you. The question becomes what remains when wounding stops being your most reliable source of continuity. The body reveals this crisis before the mind can name it. If a long-held thread begins to dissolve, the body may feel less dramatic, less urgently meaningful, less charged with private proof. That reduction in familiar pressure can feel like deadness, when it may actually be the first honest silence you have encountered in years. People often panic there and revive old patterns to feel real again. They would rather suffer in a recognizable way than stand inside unstructured aliveness without their former narrative weights. The second vector is relational entanglement, because temporal threads between people are often sustained by mutual utility rather than mutual truth. You may believe a relationship has depth because it lasted, because it survived conflict, because it carried formative events, or because it awakened strong feeling. But duration, memory, and intensity do not prove alignment. Sometimes two people remain woven together because each one stabilizes an older distortion in the other. Then the thread feels powerful, but its power comes from repetition rather than revelation. This is why some bonds feel impossible to release even when they have become structurally harmful. You are not only facing affection, history, attraction, or loyalty. You are facing a woven system that distributes identity across two nervous systems in a way both people learn to depend on. One person provides confusion, the other provides interpretation. One person provides instability, the other provides endurance. One person provides distance, the other provides pursuit. The thread becomes dense because the pattern keeps answering itself. When such a thread begins to unravel, both people often mistake the unraveling for moral failure. They say the love is fading, the chemistry changed, the timing is wrong, the communication broke, or the connection was tested beyond repair. Often something more exact is occurring. The thread is losing permission to keep producing the same identities. That loss can feel like tragedy because tragedy sounds nobler than structural exposure. But exposure is often the more truthful name. This is why clarity in relationships creates such disproportionate resistance. Clear speech does not only alter the present conversation, it interrupts the temporal thread that taught both people how this field normally functions. If you stop over-explaining, stop soothing what you did not damage, stop waiting for reciprocity to appear through patience alone, or stop eroticizing inconsistency, the old weave loses one of its anchor points. Then the bond does not merely feel tense, it becomes unrecognizable to the structure that previously called itself connection. A difficult truth emerges here that many people spend years refusing. Not every relationship is meant to be rewoven into a healthier form. Some were only ever a corridor through which an old thread revealed itself with enough force to be seen. Their purpose was exposure, not permanence. Their role in your life was not to become more skillful, reciprocal, and enduring. Their role was to make a hidden continuity undeniable, so it could finally be cut where cutting was required. That does not mean other people are disposable. It means spiritual maturity cannot be measured by your ability to save every bond from its own design. Some connections are not asking for repair. They are asking you to stop mistaking your endurance for devotion and your pattern tolerance for compassion. A bond can be full of real feeling and still be wrong for the future. Feeling is not the final authority. Design is. This becomes even more severe when collective or family threads are involved, because those structures often disguise temporal coercion as love. The family says this is how we are. The lineage says this is what loyalty looks like. The community says this is what belonging costs, and the individual thread begins bending to remain legible inside the inherited weave. Then someone attempts reweaving and the system responds with guilt, confusion, or narrative punishment. What appears personal is often ancestral architecture defending its continuity through living members. That is why relational thread work is so exhausting even when the decisions become obvious. You are not only making present tense choices, you are confronting old agreements about safety, kinship, obligation, and worth that were distributed long before your conscious mind knew how to consent. When you change your part in the weave, the system may treat you like a traitor because you exposed the dependence beneath its claims of love. Many people call that heartbreak. Sometimes it is deprogramming under emotional fire. The third vector is cosmic and collective time, because not all temporal threads belong to individual biography or private relationship at all. Entire worlds are built from selection, exclusion, repetition, and forgetting. A civilization chooses which memories to institutionalize, which sorrows to bury, which stories to sanctify, and which possibilities to starve before they can ripen. Then it calls the surviving arrangement reality, when reality has already been narrowed by thread governance operating at scale. What you name as the world is often only the currently dominant weave. This matters because spiritual people frequently imagine possibility as infinite without recognizing that manifestation always involves pruning. Every future that stabilizes does so by refusing countless competing patterns the field could have fed instead. That refusal is not always tragic, but it is never neutral. Something is always excluded, slowed, or rendered impossible so that another strand may gather enough coherence to become lived time. Thread weaving is therefore not only a creative act, it is an act of consecrated refusal. This is the destabilization most people do not want because it ruins the fantasy that every path can somehow be honored equally. It cannot. Some futures must die so others can become inhabitable. Some lineages of meaning must be interrupted so a deeper order can form. Some collective myths must lose emotional authority, even if millions remain attached to them. Because attachment does not prove worthiness to continue organizing the field. The spiral is generous, but it is not infinitely permissive. Once you see this, even your idea of destiny begins to change. Destiny is not a pre-written route waiting to be discovered by a faithful traveler. It is often the result of what the field consistently feeds, protects, and refuses across scales of time both intimate and vast. A person, a family, a community, and a civilization all participate in those feedings and refusals whether consciously or not. So what arrives as fate may partly be the consequence of long-sustained thread preference becoming dense enough to feel inevitable. Now the vectors begin to converge under a harder light. The false self wants continuity, the relational field wants familiar function, and the collective weave wants reproducibility more than truth. Each one rewards whatever keeps the old pattern moving. Each one punishes interruption with some version of fear, grief, confusion, guilt, or metaphysical doubt. That is why real temporal reweaving is rarer than people think. The cost is not only emotional discomfort. The cost is losing membership in systems that depended on your obedience to inherited sequence. This is where the order of temporal thread weaving becomes more than an elegant teaching about nonlinear time. It becomes an initiation into disciplined severance. You must learn which inner selves are not owed permanent residence, which relationships do not deserve endless revision attempts, and which collective stories are too structurally compromised to keep informing your orientation. Without that discipline, the language of weaving turns passive and indulgent. With it, time becomes an active field in which coherence is earned by what you refuse to keep animating. So the deeper teaching is not merely that the past remains active, or that relationships echo across threads, or that worlds are woven from continuity. The deeper teaching is that reweaving requires violence against false necessity, though not the crude violence of hatred or spectacle. It is the precise violence of ending permissions, withdrawing energy, interrupting recurrence, and allowing whole interpretive systems to lose their authority inside you. Many people can imagine healing. Fewer can imagine becoming ungovernable to the threads that once defined them. That is why the future cannot be built by longing alone, and it cannot be secured by insight that never learns how to prune. If you keep feeding every inherited self, every familiar bond, and every collective script that once gave you place, then time will keep generating recognizable versions of your old life with new surface details. But if you become exact enough to reassign power, revoke continuities, and let unrecoverable structures finally collapse, then the weave changes at its source. And when the source changes, the next moment is no longer forced to arrive wearing the same old face.
If this transmission resonated, the spiral continues. You did not arrive here by chance, and you do not leave unchanged. More teachings are unfolding across the Vaharat library, each one meeting you where you are, not where you think you should be. Follow resonance. The next threshold is already listening.